Okay, so week 6 discussion was on industrialization and how it basically creates some of, maybe not all of them, but some of the words that end in ISM, the isms, that historians and social scientists use to explain ideas, big pervasive political, economic, and philosophical ideas that begin to, well, effectively control the world, and many of which are in response to industrialization or industrialism, as it may be. So I'm going to go through some of these very quickly. Most of you did a reasonably good job defining them, though many of you did not either attach them to the Industrial Revolution or cite where you got the definition, which is very annoying because at this point in time in week 6, you guys should all understand citation. All right, so the Industrial Revolution itself, several people did really good jobs talking about what the Industrial Revolution actually was. Harari does a really good job talking about the development of the Industrial Revolution. Key to this is that it starts in England primarily because England has a lot of coal. And while there's some argument that they started using coal as a heating form because they ran out of wood, there's some other arguments pushing back against that today, and that whole, historiographic argument way that historians have. Um, because they were using so much coal, they figured out how to create steam and lots of it, and from steam then comes a steam engine and then steam transportation. Also, and in keeping with a lot of what Harari has been saying and Frankopan have been saying, the development of the protection of laws for, or rather, the development of laws protecting and encouraging the investment in industrial activity originates primarily in England as well. And this is a big part of what spurs industrialization there. It is of note that industrialization starts in the 1700s. We call that the first industrial revolution, and it drives mercantilism, which is part of why the British are trying so hard to control their North American colonies by passing the Navigation Acts. But with the profits coming out of it, one of the Navigation Acts was one that restrains the colonies from being able to create industry themselves. Under mercantilism, with the whole idea that you want to benefit the mother country, the British wanted the colonies to return to them raw resource to be converted through industrial processing into finished goods and then to sell them back. Now, this idea is one they're going to take to an even more expansive degree during the Second Industrial Revolution when their colonies are then India and China and other places other than the Western Hemisphere, because, of course, at the end of the 1700s, they lose the colonies in North America and they start addressing the ways in which they impose industrialization and the control of goods on their Asian colonies differently. And that's a big part of why we associate imperialism, particularly imperialism 2.0, with the Industrial Revolution, because the British actually did learn a thing or two from the mistakes they made with their North American colonies. All right. The other big reason why Britain becomes one of the driving or the first and key point for industrialization is because through the enclosure movements, through moving their people off the land and eradicating serfdom, they have a large group of unemployed and very poor people who need work. So those people are in the large urban areas, as we've been talking about, and because of that, industry becomes centered in those areas. Um, Brooks particularly does a good job of talking about why industrialization doesn't happen as rapidly in other parts of Western Europe, and there are a lot of different reasons. But when we think of the rapidity with which industrialization develops, you definitely need to think of Britain as a start point, the Western Hemisphere, and then the United States as second. And then from that, you'll see it expand into parts of Western Europe like Germany or the German principalities initially, and then by the 1870s when Germany unifies, Germany itself, you'll see it emerge to a certain extent in Russia in the 17 and 1800s under Peter and Catherine the Great, but then it kind of stalls after that, which is one of the reasons why when we get to the 1900s and the First World War, Russia does so badly in it. Austria also adapts, the Austro-Hungarians adapt a lot of industrial technology. It spreads more slowly, though, into the Middle East and from that into Asia, and there are big points talking about that as we go along. Okay, so the big social changes that come from industrialization are going to have to do primarily with migrations of people, the mass rise in urbanization, the increasing importance of capitalism and commerce as mechanisms for supporting industrialization and for industrialization making massive amounts of money. It's going to create a larger middle class. The word bourgeoisie, taken from the French, is adopted to talk about who these people are. They're not landed gentry, they're not aristocratic, but they have money. And that's going to eventually make them more significant in society than birth does. And this is a big part, again, of how industrialization is going to change the nature of how we see success and how the classes develop. In the United States, you're going to get a small class at the very, very top of very wealthy industrialists, but they're going to come to control politics. And even into this day, when we think of the people in power, they're normally people who have made a lot of money, usually through investments, through Wall Street, in the case of Bezos and the Facebook guy, through creating something that a lot of people use or want. The new revolution in technology, of course, is the revolution in social media and in digital technology, all of which are basically intellectual property things that are creating massive amounts of wealth for people. So we'll get to that as we get further into the course. We get what is called the working class. These used to be serfs or peasants. Now they are the poor who have nowhere else to turn and end up having to work in textile mills in order to support themselves. If you did the CTE for this week, then you know already how horrific conditions were, especially for children, but the conditions are pretty horrific for everybody working in the working class. Industry creates very dirty cities. It creates a tremendous amount of sludge. Large cities begin to stink. They are pervasively covered in black clouds that are produced from the industrial processing. The inside of many of the textile mills are filled with lint, so a lot of people are going to die early from emphysema and from other lung-related diseases that develop because you've got cotton fibers in your lungs. It really becomes just urban areas become horrific to live in. There you go, the sludge, horse manure, all the things. Disease was prevalent because people were forced to live together in very crowded conditions. They didn't have enough good food or food that was good for them. They were dependent entirely upon whatever they could afford to buy. Buildings were dangerous. I mean, it really is just a horrific way to live. It thus spawns social critics, and this is a large part of where the isms come from. And we break them into two different groups. There's the group of people who are looking for making society better for the collective everybody. And the isms that emerge from this are socialism, communism, and nationalism. And then you're going to get the individual isms, which are the isms that are created principally by the wealthy, who are looking to retain their wealth by way of maximizing individualism. So, under collectivism, we get socialism, and most of you did a pretty decent job with this. The problem with socialism is socialism historically is a complicated word. It originates in the early 1800s as the idea, and again, the early 1800s, this is going to be that period where we're moving from the first industrial revolution into the second industrial revolution. If you did the CTE, this is where the Sadler Committee comes along and starts questioning the way people are living in England. Socialism emerges as a word that basically says we should split the wealth. Instead of it all going to the people at the top, the people who are doing the actual hard work should get some of it as well. So the idea initially of socialism wasn't per se equal distribution of everything, but it was certainly a redistribution of the wealth so that the people who were actually doing the work weren't suffering. Now, where things begin to go to the bad is that different groups of socialists begin to redefine the term or to argue for different things. And the most notable ones of these are going to be the communists, who emerge as a group of people who say it shouldn't be that we should split it or redistribute it based on different standards. It should be an equal division to everybody. So communism emerges as the idea that everything should be split equally among everyone. There shouldn't be any kind of allocation because you invested. There shouldn't be any kind of inequality in the redistribution of wealth. Marx is going to take it a step further, and I'll post this. You can read it as you want. Marx is going to take it further because when Marx comes along in the 1850s, by that point in time, after watching the revolutions of 1848 and seeing them fail, he argues that the only way you're ever going to get an equitable divide among people is by the government controlling everything and by the proletariat, the workers, literally rising up in open revolt and taking everything, because that's the only way that the wealthy or the bourgeoisie are ever going to give anything up. So you effectively have three different variations on the same idea, and that idea is redistribution of wealth. Socialists argue that it can be done democratically, it can be done by people choosing what things should be made more equal for everybody, usually things like the necessities of life, water, heat, food, clothing, things like that. Communists argue everything should be equal, and then Marxists order or argue that the only way you're ever going to get that done is through literally complete demolition of the society and open rebellion. So that's part of where in the 1800s things get complicated, is because people are confusing what the terminology means, and certainly today we confuse what the terminology means. Today, because of the way in which the Russian Revolution plays out and the fact that Stalin goes in, takes control, and turns Russia into a totalitarian state, the fact that Mao turned China into a totalitarian state, the totalitarianism is what we have come to associate with communism, which is not the way idealistic communists argue. The ones in the 1800s basically said, no, everybody just needs to vote. Again, kind of like socialists, they argued for voting or using the democratic process to get to this end stage. Whereas Marx came along and said, no, it's never going to happen democratically because the wealthy are always going to control politics. So you're going to have to just take it by brute force. All right, so that's where your three isms are. One of the other isms that is a collectivist ism is nationalism. And many of you did a good job with this in terms of talking about its origins. It comes out of a pushback against imperialism. Where we begin to see it initially arise is in places like the Balkans, who were trying to win their independence from Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, who've been fighting over them for several centuries. We see it begin to arise, well, we've already seen it arise in the Western Hemisphere, in North America. It arises as a byproduct of the War of 1812 in the United States, surprisingly not in the Revolution. The Revolution was not a nationalist movement so much as it was an organization of the different emerging states to fight together to win their independence, but they all wanted personal autonomy within the states itself. So it wasn't nationalism then. Nationalism comes along after the end of the War of 1812, or the Second American Revolution, as some American historians call it, when the U.S. definitively breaks its connection with Britain and basically says you can't meddle around in our affairs. Throughout the Latin American revolutions, however, you do see nationalism as a motivator. The idea that the people in the different Spanish colonies wanted their independence and to create their own nations, that they were running themselves, was very much one of the binding points among them. So nationalism begins to emerge there. Certainly in Europe, it emerges as a byproduct, again, of the of the Napoleonic Wars. And then after that, as a byproduct of Metternich and the idea that you had this body of these big guys who were running everything, and many peoples in Europe began to push back. They didn't want to be part of empires. They didn't want to be dictated to by people who were outside of their community. So nationalism emerges as a bonding point for peoples who are trying to push away from imperialism. The problem with nationalism, of course, as maybe pointed out, is that extreme nationalism isn't just about uh, saying that your country is good. It's about saying that your country is better than any other country. And that's what we're going to begin to see in the 1900s, particularly moving into World War I and definitely after World War I, this idea of superlatization of nationalism. All right, today nationalism, most of you did a pretty good job with that. Certainly we're seeing a rise of it in the US. It's a big part of what the one of the political parties is pushing very hard. And again, it's also intrinsically tied up in fascism, which we're not to yet, because fascism definitely idealizes the nation of the people that it's in and does place them above everyone else. All right, so in opposition to the individualistic isms, or in opposition to the collectivist isms like socialism, communism, Marxism, and nationalism, you have the individualistic isms, which are ones that basically put the individual above everything else, or that work for the idea of maximizing the individual's potential. Among these are conservatism, romanticism, classical liberalism, which is what we today associate with conservatism, libertarianism, and capitalism. I'm going to hit these pretty quickly. Conservatism is the idea that we like tradition. We like the way things were done in the past. It literally means to keep things the same. Its oppositional term is liberalism, which means to change things. And it's important to understand that these two terms, while we use them politically, aren't always associated with the same party all the time. It is not uncommon at all for parties' philosophies to change once they achieve whatever their goal was. For example, the Republican Party of the United States, founded in effectively 1842, started as a very liberal party because it was arguing for a major change in American politics, economics, and society. And that change was for the elimination of slavery, which was a very radical idea at the time, and it was one that was pushed back against by even moderates in society, like, no, I'm not sure about that. By 1850, they have emerged as a prominent party. And by 1860, they actually have won an election. So they started out as a party advocating a major change, a very liberal party. The party that wanted things to stay the same in that period was the Democratic Party, which was a very conservative, keep things the same, things are working fine, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, a very conservative party. And would remain so literally up until the 1960s. And that's basically when the parties begin, well, they start flipping before that, but certainly by the 1960s, the Democratic Party has now become the party for change, and the Republican Party has become the party for keeping things the same. And that's kind of where we are today. So effectively what happens with the Republican Party after the Civil War, and the period of Reconstruction after Lincoln's assassination, the Republican Party becomes the party of stability. They've accomplished what they set out to do. They've done away with slavery. They've managed to get through Congress the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, basically giving African Americans citizenship and giving African Americans the right to vote. But then Reconstruction fails. The Republicans are very tired of it. They're moving into the heart of the Second Industrial Revolution in the wake of a pretty massive depression in the 1870s and the 1890s. So they become very much more invested in saving the country's economy by pushing capitalism. And this is pretty much where they change from being the Liberal Party, the one that wanted change, to being the one that wanted things to stay the same. During the Gilded Age, the Republicans pretty much dominate politics, and their biggest driving thing is to try to maximize the economy by supporting industrialists in every way possible, including things like preventing um, laws or stopping laws or movements having to do with letting women vote, doing away with Jim Crow laws, and or doing away or preventing minimum wage requirements or limiting working hours or anything like that. That's a big part of why the um, Dilling letter was being written in 1916. Is because the Republicans up until that point in time had managed via this idea of states' rights not to have the federal government intervene in any way in the economy. All right, so this is a big part of where our conservatives are today. They're still principally in the Republican Party, which is advocating for as little change as possible. And in fact, in some respects, I'd like to, dare I say, go backwards. Romanticism, those of you who discussed it, for the most part, discussed it well. It was a reaction to the Enlightenment, the idea that reason can't solve everything. So the Romantics began to push back against reason and to look for ways to evoke emotion, particularly personal emotion. Um, for that reason, we tend to think of them as well, the great sweeping landscapes in art, the great passionate music. In fact, I was listening to something the other day that was talking about opera being the romantic counter to classical music, that here we're putting poetry to music, literally, and also making music poetic. So it was that whole idea of tying those two together. Classical liberalism is, again, strangely today, what we might call conservatism. Classical liberalism was the pushback against monarchy, against mercantilism, against the idea of a government that didn't support what you wanted it to do. The classical liberals are basically guys like Jefferson, Madison, Locke, Hume, Adam Smith, all of these guys. Um, we call it classical liberalism because at the time it was a very liberal idea. These ideas that government should be receptive to the needs of the people, that government's role was to protect individual liberties, not to curtail them, the idea that government should not regulate economies. These were all very different and very liberal ideas advocating for change at the time. Today we take them for granted. Today they are actually like conservative views because that's what we do. So that's the tradition now. So that's why we call it classical liberalism, or today conservatism, because it has flipped, right? There you go. The idea of connecting liberty to private property, the idea that the government should support private property, all of these are classical liberal ideas. Liberalism today is more of a collectivist. It's more today the idea that we want to maximize the benefit for all people, which is a very liberal view because it is in opposition to the individualistic view that government should be responsive and should stay out of the economy. And a big part of what we try to do in the US today, the big reason why there's so much annoyance with the current Congress, is because there's a balance point between these two. And it's a democratic process to determine where things shift. And that democratic process is based on people voting for their elective representatives and their elected representatives finding compromise points, not locking down and allowing a small minority to basically obstruct everything else. That's not the way a democratic government is supposed to work. So, okay, our next individualist is libertarianism. It is literally as small a government as you can have, with the belief that government should be basically there to benefit liberty. Law should be used to protect people from each other if necessary, but that anything done by consensual people in the privacy of their homes is up to them. The government should not be involved in that at all. So libertarianisms are, a true libertarian is someone who believes that the individual liberty is the maximal point, that government shouldn't be involved in virtually regulating anything at all. That should all be on the free market. So I'll let you, again, read through those. Capitalism, which we've already talked about, an idea that maximizes individual wealth by allowing individuals to invest as they want to, however they want to, do whatever they want with their own money, minimize taxes on them, allow them to spend their money as they wish in hopes that that will go back into society. So, all right. Yeah, these are all your basic things on this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Pros and cons of capitalism. We've been talking about these from the start, and that's a big part of what Frankman and Harari talk about, the pros and cons of capitalism. Harari particularly. Capitalism is good in many respects and bad in other respects. So the big pros are efficient allocation of capital resources, labor and means of production follow capital in the system, allows for more people to have jobs, allows for more profits to be made. Competition leads to lower consumer prices. That's why you hear so much, especially right now, about the DOJ going after monopolies or what they consider to be monopolies, like Google. In an ideal capitalist society, capitalists compete with each other, and through that process of competition, the best, if you will, wins out. Wages and general standards of living rise overall, as long as there is no unfair advantage given to anybody, and as long as the system doesn't marginalize, or and by the system I mean the government, doesn't support one group, either the industrialists or labor, over the other. It also spurs innovation and invention, and certainly there is no way today that we could argue against that, given that every year we get a new iPhone, we get a new this, that, or the other. We're going to Mars. We're doing all kinds of things, all at the behest, principally, of private companies. The cons, however, are that it creates inherent class conflict, which it does. And we see that ongoing now with the whole issue of whether or not we should be raising the minimum wage, etc. It generates enormous wealth disparities and social inequalities. It can incentivize corruption and crony capitalism in the pursuit of profit, and this is where we talk about governments. One of the big issues today is government corruption, the idea that many of our leaders in Washington have information about things going on Wall Street and so forth, and sell stock off before a company collapses because they know about it. That's cronyism. That's not supposed to be legal, but it happens. And of course, just general corruption, buying off contracts, that sort of thing. And it also produces negative effects like, well, pollution is where I was when I wrote this. I would also now argue climate change, the fact that we can't get any laws passed that are going to stem climate change or protecting wildlife or any of those sorts of things. So yeah, it's definitely bad in that respect. All right. So different varieties of capitalism. We live in what is effectively called a mixed economy, in that we have some socialism in our economy. We have things like welfare. We have things like unemployment insurance and unemployment. We have a government system that's helping us regulate health care. These are all elements that are helping people very much, but there are also ways in which the government and in which we are controlling what's going on in the capitalistic market. But then we have to, because those are areas where capitalism definitely does not provide in and of itself for people. So we have what's called a mixed capitalist system in the U.S. Okay, so other isms, there are a lot of other isms out there that we'll encounter as we go along. And like I said, when we get to World War II, we're going to get into things like fascism, totalitarianism, all the big isms that are extensions of these. So you really need to understand these before we get anywhere else. If you look at this, there are a couple of others that I have in here simply because they're of interest. Anarchism, nihilism, these are all kind of fun ones that I like. They're definitely individualistic. And of course, my select bibliography for you. All right, so I want to say a couple of things. One is that I've noticed this thing lately where people are basically just dropping in little one-liners about Frankopan and Harari, saying things like, oh yeah, they talk about blah, blah, blah. Okay, great. You know what? That doesn't count because as I've tried to make clear from the start, you must cite, in which case you must go directly to a page and give me a specific example from Frankopan and Harari in order for those to be counted in your discussions. So from this point out, if I don't see an actual citation with a page number, because if you're using a book, and Frankopan and Harari are excerpts, they are chapters that I have myself copied for you. So I know they have page numbers on them. If you're not using page numbers to show me directly where you're getting that, then they're not going to count as references to them. So let's not do that. And another reminder, posting on Monday, it's an automatic 0 because there's, in a discussion, posting on Monday is an automatic 0. There's no reason to be posting on Monday. It is due on Thursday. It's 10% off per day for 3 days, not 4. So at this point, if you can't get it in by Sunday, then it's a 0. If you're going to post it on Monday, then you're going to get a 0. And if you're going to post it on Sunday and you haven't let me know why, it's going to be 30% off, which means the highest you can make if you have 100% is 70. So think about that for a minute. All right, if you have questions about the isms, let me know. Otherwise, I will post for you a video for the other two, the next two discussions, 7 and 8. Over the weekend, and I will be getting to you the annotated bibliography form, so you have that. It is due the 21st.